Hey everyone, Happy New Year's. Thanks for your time as always. It's not just the end of the year, but the end of the fourth quarter of 2024. So even though it was a relatively quiet week, that wasn't the case for the quarter. This video reviews the events of the last quarter of the year as they relate to the Artemis II, III, and IV missions NASA continues to plan for the rest of the decade. The quarter spawned another big proverbial elephant for the room, as the election year ended in November with the re-election of President Trump. It's not a standard re-election, and the rumors are that it won't be a standard transition for Artemis. Big changes could be coming in just a few weeks. I'll go through the other events of the quarter, and there's more detail for those. NASA finally completed the Orion Base Heat Shield investigation, started stacking the Artemis II vehicle at the Kennedy Space Center, and rescheduled Artemis II and III again. Rescheduled meaning delayed. The biggest spectacles of the quarter were the two Starship flight tests. I'll also go over the known status and mostly unknown outlook for these three Artemis missions, at least as currently constituted, as we head into the bigger political sort of unknown in a few weeks. The biggest event of the quarter by far was the re-election of President Trump, which will put Elon Musk in the inner circle of the most powerful office in the world. Musk is already in charge of a large empire, but will now have direct influence on the presidential administration's plans for Artemis. Little has been detailed about their plans so far, but the reporting on intentions through back channels continues to suggest that the old-school government programs like SLS and Orion are in some jeopardy. There are a lot of moving parts to that, and Congress will have a say in the ultimate outcome, but it's something that has to be taken seriously heading into 2025. At a high level for Artemis activities and messaging, there was the same theme of mixed messages throughout the quarter. We saw obvious steps of progress or leaps of progress, catches of progress, but accompanied by mostly silence about the outlook for 2025 and beyond, and whether these target launch dates that change once or twice a year are realistic. The last several years suggests that those dates are more aspirational than realistic, even with NASA and SpaceX pulling off big test flights like the Starship ones or Artemis I. With the heads of private industry influencing or controlling government policy beginning next year, that silence from NASA and its private partners is likely to continue, since it's the public programs, fully funded by taxpayers, that appear to be in jeopardy. Reviewing events of the quarter, we went into October looking for details about the Orion Heat Shield investigation, and that ended up taking almost until the end of the quarter. After some political haggling, SpaceX secured a launch license for the next Starship flight test in the first half of October, rather than it taking until Thanksgiving. That flight test accomplished the first Super Heavy booster recovery, and again soft-landed the ship on the surface of an ocean most of the way around the world. NASA got closer to the window of opportunity to begin stacking the Artemis II vehicle in early October, when Mobile Launcher 1 rolled back from Launch Pad 39B into High Bay 3 of the vehicle assembly building. But then Hurricane Milton disrupted work for more than a week. NASA had previously emphasized that there was 3 to 4 weeks of stacking preps required between the Mobile Launcher and High Bay 3, so the earliest that stacking could have started was around Halloween or the beginning of November. But the space agency had also emphasized that they wanted to wait until completion of the heat shield investigation before fully committing to stacking. At the end of October, leadership within NASA's Exploration Directorate said they found the root cause of the Orion heat shield behavior, but the investigation was still not complete and no decisions or details were provided at that time. Outside the VAB, we saw the chair structures assembled on the base of Mobile Launcher 2 by prime contractor Bechtel. I also got an update from the SLS Stages office on the status of core stage production via an interview, and NASA and Boeing also released pictures in the Space Systems Processing Facility, the SSPF, after the second core stage engine section unit was transferred into Boeing's integration work area at the end of the month. Those pictures showed the engine sections for core stage 3 and core stage 4 set up side by side. Boeing's ambition at the time was to complete those two full units over the next 2 years, so by the end of 2026. At the beginning of November, we saw the re-election of President Trump to the first non-consecutive second term since the 19th century. That brings the promise of big changes, which is rumored to include a major shakeup for Artemis. There were big developments in November and December, but that change in government and possible redefinition of government beginning next year casts a long shadow or just plain old overshadows developments for the remainder of the current administration. There's lots of speculation about whether SLS is in jeopardy, and if so, whether that might also have repercussions for Orion and Gateway. Exploration Ground Systems is heavily intertwined with SLS, particularly the launch part of its launch and recovery responsibilities, so if SLS were to go, then EGS would also change significantly too. Mid-month, another Starship flight test repeated the same suborbital Earth once around flight profile as the previous launch, but included a successful in-flight Raptor restart demonstration. That restart test is directly linked to Artemis objectives, but if SpaceX needs to master rapid reusability first, then all these flight tests are critical to Artemis, even if NASA isn't paying for any of them. Also beginning mid-month, EGS staged the first two SLS solid rocket booster segments, the aft assemblies, for stacking. The next week, just before Thanksgiving, those were mounted on the mobile launcher, which began Artemis II stacking officially, but didn't start the booster stacking clock. The moves indicated that NASA certainly had not ruled out flying Artemis II as is, but the space agency did not provide any update on when a decision or announcement would occur. They had previously advised that they hoped to be able to say something by the end of the year. It turned out that decision and announcement happened the week after Thanksgiving. A full televised press conference was announced on only about 24 hours' notice, and on Thursday, December 5th, that media briefing was held. But that long shadow cast by the incoming Trump administration, with Musk being a senior advisor to President Trump, to some extent overshadowed the long-awaited Orion heat shield decision. Much earlier than typical for a NASA administrator nomination, President Trump picked Jared Isaacman for that position, and he will take office when confirmed by the Senate next year. In the press conference, the current NASA leadership noted that they had not yet received anyone from Trump's transition team at that point, and Isaacman was nominated early enough to be a part of that, but subsequent reporting indicates that Mr. Isaacman is not involved in those discussions. He won't be administrator until after confirmation, and he may also want to reserve judgment until after his Senate confirmation hearing or hearings. The press conference to announce the conclusion of the Orion heat shield investigation was only the second Artemis media briefing of its kind, and the final one for the year. NASA had previously announced that they understood the root cause of the heat shield char loss, so the two major announcements of news were they were going to fly Artemis II as is, and that both Artemis II and Artemis III were delayed until April 2026 and mid-2027 respectively. There was a good deal of detail about the root cause, about the change in re-entry trajectory required for Artemis II, and about an hour's worth of questions from us media types. Even with the ground that was covered in that hour, though, there was still the better part of a year's worth of intrigue and details left over. The next week, the SLS core stage for Artemis II was transferred from the floor of the VAB transfer aisle into Boeing's new vertical final assembly facility in High Bay 2. That facility will support final assembly of the next unit for Artemis III, but it also provides an early opportunity for work on the Artemis II stage that has to be done while it's vertical before the solid rocket boosters are ready for mating with it. Then, the final non-holiday work week of the year saw booster stacking resume, with the left aft center segment being lifted and mated to the aft segment and starting the quote-unquote stacking clock for that booster. A media event was held at KSC, which provided an opportunity to ask more of the backlog of questions, but had kind of a weird vibe. It was a pretty typical KSC media event opportunity, but not at a typical time. Following closely on the heels of the press conference, the teams working on the Artemis hardware and planning schedules are still reworking those. NASA exploration leadership said they look at the April 2026 target for Artemis II as a no later than date, but the Orion schedules are still to be determined, and it's hard to gauge whether April 2026 is optimistic, conservative, or realistic. Some work will continue around the Christmas and New Year's holidays, but we'll probably see most of the updates on that in the new quarter and the new year. Artemis II has been in the news for most of the quarter, and milestones like the beginning of stacking and the Orion heat shield investigation have been part of the weekly coverage. Looking at the status of plans and preparations for the mission, EGS has placed 3 of the 10 solid rocket booster segments on the mobile launcher so far, beginning with the 2 aft assemblies, which are more complicated than the rest of the segments. After NASA leadership concluded the Orion heat shield investigation on December 5th, EGS and SRB prime contractor Northrop Grumman began taking and analyzing measurements of the J-leg or J-joint part of the case-to-case field joints, which factor into the determination of mission-specific or flight-specific operational life. The 12-month stack life is a generic duration that any set of segments are certified for, without needing to make flight-specific measurements, analysis, and determinations. At the KSC Media event on December 16th, I asked Mark Pond, Senior Director of NASA Programs for Northrop Grumman Propulsion Systems, about those measurements. I think Amit was talking in the press conference last week about doing measurements to, measuring the, slump measurements. Are there
Mark
any?
knows more about the slump measurements and the.
Is there any? Is that primarily what you're measuring, or are there other things that you're measuring when you do those for the stacking clock?
For the stack life, yeah. It's primarily the measurements of the thermal protection system that protects the field joint, and so it is exactly that. You're looking to make sure that everything can support for sure 12 months. Obviously, we know that before it leaves the factory, and then we have an opportunity to extend as those numbers come in, and so we would have that data. But it's all to support stack life. Yes.
Okay. I mean, is it, when I'd asked about this before with Artemis I, they talked about the J leg or the J joint. Is that what you're measuring?
Yes.
But I mean, is that driven is that driven by the propellant? It's on top of it essentially.
Yeah. So it's all connected, right? So the external insulation and the thermal protection system, and then the inhibitors that inhibit the motor operation during motor operation, or inhibit the propellant during motor operation, all that is connected. So as that propellant, it's a polymer, right? So it'll slump a little bit, and so it's all connected, and you measure that to make sure that it's moving the way that we expect it to.
Stepping back, EGS is projecting that they will be working on SLS in the VAB into the summer. The forecast discussed at the mid-December media event has the boosters being stacked around March and being ready for mating with the core stage. That's also when the core stage is supposed to be ready for that mate. This podcast is about details, so an aside is that transferring the core stage from High Bay 2 to High Bay 3 will require the same double breakover that we saw a few times in the Space Shuttle program, when an orbiter had to be moved from one stack in High Bay 1 to another in High Bay 3. In other words, when a core stage is completed by Boeing in High Bay 2, it has to switch cranes. One 325-ton crane moves between High Bays 1 and 2, and the other moves between High Bays 3 and 4. So, like the orbiters had to do a few times, after the core stage is lifted out of the High Bay 2 tooling, it will be rotated to horizontal with the help of a second crane, and lowered onto a carrier transporter on the VAB transfer aisle floor. The cranes will be disconnected, the core stage transporters will move the stage from in between High Bays 1 and 2 to in between High Bays 3 and 4, and then that 325-ton crane will be hooked up to the top of the stage. And with the help of the 175-ton crane again, we'll pick it up and rotate it back to vertical. After the second crane is again disconnected, the core can be lifted up and over the diaphragm into High Bay 3 to be mated to the boosters. EGS projects that they will have SLS put together on the mobile launcher around mid-April. That would be the boosters, the core stage, the launch vehicle stage adapter, and the interim cryogenic propulsion stage. They will then complete connections between the SLS elements and between SLS and the mobile launcher, and then start running through the integrated test and checkout. That's projected to run out into the summer right now. For the Artemis II Orion, the spacecraft is back in the final assembly and systems test, or FAST cell, in the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building at KSC. The second round of vacuum testing was completed at the beginning of December, and the crew module batteries that were modified to handle the full envelope of abort loads were reinstalled shortly after that. With the heat shield decision behind them and major testing complete, they began installing the backshell panels on the crew module in mid-December. Even with that SLS assembly and test work projected to take a good deal of 2025, the schedule to get Orion ready to stack on top of SLS could be a longer one. The Orion program managers for NASA and prime contractor Lockheed Martin were at the media event. They are reworking their schedules now, post-decision, but they were projecting that the solar array wings would not be installed until the spring, which would effectively be into the second quarter of 2025, and would mean that handover to EGS would probably be April or later. Earlier schedule exercises put that EGS handover milestone around 8 months prior to launch readiness. That would theoretically provide margin for April 2026, but probably makes an earlier launch date challenging because it probably also assumes that there are 0 hiccups next year for everyone. For SLS, the program is taking advantage of the opportunity to do vertical maintenance work on the core stage in High Bay 2. That will include flashing cards in the 4 RS-25 engine controller units, which have to be removed and sent to the vendor. That also includes preparing to retest some main propulsion system valves in the engine section, and possibly adding some hardware to address the vortex issues seen during Artemis I. SLS still needs to decide which options to go with there. As noted in last week's video, there is the bigger picture option to break off the vertical work in High Bay 2 and defer it until after the stage is mated to the SRBs. That will depend on the progress of booster stacking and completing some of these get-ahead work items on the core stage in High Bay 2. In terms of the forward outlook for Artemis II, the focus is on the Orion schedule. In the near term, one of the things we'll be looking for is when those final installs start with the solar arrays, then the service module fairings, then the forward bay cover. We'll also be looking for an update from Orion officials about ways to speed things up next year to reach that milestone where Orion is ready to stack on SLS sooner. And we'll be following the progress to see where those big milestones happen. EGS handover will coincide with the move to the multi-payload processing facility, and the spacecraft would move from the MPPF to the Launch Abort System Facility, or LASF, after all the commodities are loaded and the spacecraft checks out in the MPPF. LAS stacking and encapsulation follows in the LASF, and the LAS and fairing are tested with Orion and closed out. Then the spacecraft would be ready to roll to the VAB for stacking on SLS. Depending on how final Orion installs progress in the ONC building and how SLS stacking goes in the first quarter of 2025, we may see NASA make a decision about the tanking test they want to do before Artemis II. They are waiting to choose between performing that test with or without Orion. One of the questions is how much progress they want to see before making that decision. Both Orion final assembly and the EGS work to assemble and check out SLS seem to be running well into next year. NASA took a long time to make a decision about the heat shield, so it wouldn't be a surprise if the tanking test decision is also pushed out well into next year. We should have a better idea about progress by the end of the first quarter, depending on whether that tanking test decision is made by then. At the KSC media event on December 16th, Amit Kshatriya, who is head of the Moon to Mars program office within NASA's Exploration Directorate, said they want to challenge the teams to have the vehicle ready to roll out by the end of 2025.
We said no later then because we meant no later. I think it's super important that right now we spent a lot of time dispositioning the Orion. We spent a lot of time working on process improvements here. I believe we have taken a lot of the risk out of the integration flow here, out up front, because of the time we've been working on getting the development activity done for 2. So I think it's very realistic. In fact, I want the crew, and we said it during the conference, I want to roll the stack out at the end of the year. And I want to set a date earlier than April because I want to challenge this team to do that. We have got to get our launch probability up. It's going to be very difficult to launch this vehicle given the constraints that we put on it from the interrogation of the heat shield. So, and that's a good thing because trying to launch this vehicle for the 3rd mission when we have to go meet Starship in lunar orbit is going to be really, really tough. And so the better we can get at meeting those commitments, meeting those stacking timelines, that in and of itself is an organizational test objective that I want to put onto the team. So what I tell you is I have confidence that these guys are ready to go do it. Now we're going to run into problems. Of course we are. That's just the name of this business. If you look at the size and scale of the machine behind me and then all the other parts that have to come together, absolutely. But I think that this team can do it.
Longer term, as we get farther into 2025, we'll be looking for signs about how realistic that goal is. The big questions for Artemis II in 2025, at least headed into 2025, begin with when will Orion leave the ONC building and head to the MPPF. That signals the handover to EGS for launch preparations. The tanking test is another good measuring stick. As with Artemis I, we'll be watching to see when the rollout is for that tanking test, and how closely that test campaign out at Pad 39B follows the schedules and plans for the testing. Looking at the status of plans and preparations for Artemis III, Starship flight testing resumed. There was a little clarity for Orion based on the decisions that NASA made about the heat shield investigation, and during the quarter we got some updates on the critical production pieces for SLS. For the Starship HLS Option A lunar lander, SpaceX has not provided a schedule roadmap for overall Starship development. The lunar lander is a variant of the foundational design that is in development prototyping right now. The next Starship flight test, number 7, is another Earth Once Around mission with the continued focus on that foundational rapid reuse capability. Until and unless there's a big picture update on the flight test schedule, we're waiting to see when Starship development turns a corner on demonstration of the technology that the Artemis III mission needs. Starship continues to make demonstrable progress, and SpaceX remains well ahead of the rest of the industry. But Starship was behind past schedules and remains behind the most recent ones published. The future also continues to be cloudy. It's unclear when SpaceX plans to be able to conduct those Artemis-related Starship tech demonstrations. They will turn the proverbial corner on this program, but it's hard to tell when that will be. Without a good understanding of how much work remains, it's hard to tell if Starship can be ready for Artemis III even by the new delayed mid-2027 target launch date. Given all the logistics launches required by Starship tankers before the crew would launch to start the mission, SpaceX only has about 2 years to complete the rest of the HLS development to meet the new date. For the lunar surface spacesuits that Axiom Space is developing for Artemis III, the only news on development during the quarter was an update to the schedule. The critical design review was pushed from this year into 2025, and with the delay in the target launch date, Axiom Space has a little bit more time to work with. I sent an email to Axiom Space requesting information, but still haven't heard back from them. As with Starship and SpaceX, this development work is private, so neither Axiom nor SpaceX are obligated to make any public disclosures. For exploration ground systems, all the improvements to the mobile launcher and software and hardware upgrades to ground infrastructure for Artemis II would carry over to Artemis III. EGS is not planning any major upgrades, so direct work for Artemis III won't begin until after Artemis II launches, when EGS will refurbish the hardware and fix any software and hardware issues that come up during the Artemis II launch campaign. As we learned a couple weeks back, the Orion program had already decided in the early fall that they needed to rebuild the heat shield for Artemis III, or at least the AVCOAT blocks for that. So we will be looking to see progress with manufacturing new AVCOAT blocks, bonding those to one of the 2 carrier structures that could be available, and then getting into verification and validation for the completed heat shield. In terms of the overall Artemis III build for Orion, the service module seems to be ahead of the crew module, given the scope of changes to the crew module for Artemis II. The Orion program is still going through the learning curve with all the environmental control and life support system upgrades to the crew module for Artemis II. The service module was being prepared for a proof pressure test of the orbital tube welds between the European service module and the crew module adapter. The crew module is in integration with wire harness and some component installs in progress. I asked about the NASA docking system hardware for the Artemis III build, and as of mid-December it was said to still be boxed up. It was noted that the schedules for all the Orion builds are being reworked, so it's no longer clear when the 2 modules will be powered up in 2025. That had been projected for the spring. For SLS, most of the vehicle is basically ready for stacking. The solid rocket booster motors and exit cones are complete and in storage. and the forward and aft assembly hardware are almost done. At the KSC media event, Northrop Grumman officials said that the aft skirts have already been hot-fired, and they are basically completing documentation, and then they will go back into storage. The SRB forward assemblies for Artemis III should have their documentation filled out by the middle of 2025, and then they'll wait in storage until Artemis III stacking is imminent. Similarly, the ICPS, LVSA, and OSA for Artemis III are complete and in storage. The LVSA and OSA will need to be transported to KSC, but the target date was pushed out, so it's now 2.5 years away. Other SLS hardware that's ready to support Artemis III are the 4 L3 Harris RS-25 engines that are also in storage. Those will now be installed at KSC, and L3 Harris is finishing work to reactivate the engine shop in the VAB, which existed back in the 1980s for Space Shuttle main engines. L3 Harris officials said they are planning to start practicing handling and installation of engines around the middle of 2025. Engine installations will be done vertically now, and they are staging a new Pathfinder engine that will be kept at KSC for practice in between builds. As we've noted throughout December, construction and activation of the new Boeing facility for Core Stage Final Assembly was completed at the beginning of the month, and Core Stage 2 is inaugurating the tooling for the next few months. That leaves production of Core Stage 3 for Artemis III as the last item that SLS needs to complete to be ready for the mission. Both major subassemblies are critical to the Core Stage 3 build schedule, the engine section and the quote-unquote 4/5 part of the stage. That's the forward skirt, liquid oxygen tank, inner tank, and liquid hydrogen tank. Right now, reactivating the thermal protection system foam spray facility in New Orleans is critical to the 4/5 schedule. Cell N at the Michoud Assembly Facility was supposed to come back online right around New Year's, so we'll see about an update after the holidays. The LH2 tank was ready first, so it will be sprayed in Cell N first. That would be followed by the LOX tank, which first needs to go through Cell P and get its coat of corrosion protection primer sprayed on there. After the LH2 tank gets its foam sprays, it will be stacked on top of an engine section simulator, currently projected around mid-2025. That aft joint will then continue to be outfitted. The other two elements at MAF, the forward skirt and the inner tank, are basically waiting for the LOX tank. After the LOX tank gets its primer and foam sprays, it needs some further outfitting before it's ready for the forward join with the forward skirt and the inner tank. Those two joins, the forward and aft joins, would then be connected, and the 4/5 shipped to KSC in the back half of 2025. In the meantime, engine section integration in the Space Systems Processing Facility, or SSPF, at Kennedy Space Center is supposed to wrap up sometime around mid-2025, and then it would move to High Bay 2 when it is ready for the 4/5 to be stacked on top of it. For the forward outlook for Artemis III, in the near term for Starship, Flight Test Number 6 accomplished the Raptor in-space restart demonstration, but it's unclear when the first orbital flight test will occur, either which flight test or when on the calendar that is scheduled. Beyond Flight Test 7, the forward outlook is unclear or unknown. Similarly, for the Axiom Space spacesuits for moonwalks, the last update came in an annual review done by the Government Accounting Office that was released in the middle of 2024. It's possible that the 2025 version of that audit will be the next chance for a detailed update on development status, such as the human-in-the-loop vacuum test and the critical design review. For Orion, schedules are now being replanned post-heat shield decision, so we'll have to wait for that. For SLS, we'll be watching to see when the 5 major core stage elements start to be connected with each other during 2025. Longer term, it's harder to say how realistic the new mid-2027 target launch date is. Given the lack of obligations to disclose program details, the outlook for Starship HLS and the Axiom spacesuit remains unknown. Both of them are scheduled to complete their critical design reviews in 2025, so we may be able to take the temperature of those schedules at that time. Otherwise, the big picture might remain inconclusive for yet another year. Except again, if Trump and Musk decide to do one of the rumored variations of an Artemis reset. Orion and SLS continue building their hardware for Artemis III. We'll have to keep an eye on that progress, but Artemis II still has to fly, and the outcome and results of that mission will have to be digested too. At this time a year ago, at the end of 2023, Artemis III was still scheduled for the end of 2025. Even though the target date was delayed another 18 months or so, all the question marks for Artemis III are still there, from Starship to SLS. It's still hard to tell how close or how far all the programs are from their schedules, and that mixed messaging of completing milestones with little context to go on continues. Although Artemis II and III were recently delayed again, the Artemis IV target date of September 2028 hasn't been updated recently. But that could be in jeopardy depending on all the elements in development or construction that need to be completed. There wasn't much news about development of Artemis IV elements beyond Mobile Launcher 2 construction during the quarter. For the Gateway and Starship elements in development for Artemis IV, there was either little or no news. The Habitation and Logistics Outpost module milestone of transportation to the U.S. for outfitting was delayed until 2025, but otherwise there was no updated news and no updated forecast for Gateway, Gateway Logistics, or for the Option B upgrades to the Starship lunar lander. Obviously, we're watching to see if outside events nullify current plans for the future of SLS. That would directly affect EGS-2, and we don't know yet if President Trump and Elon Musk have plans to terminate the other government programs. It's not clear how long that process would take, so we'll continue to monitor these programs for updates on progress. For Exploration Ground Systems, Mobile Launcher 2 is the primary focus of development for Artemis IV. After the base of the structure was built out and placed on the pedestals at the East Park site in the spring, construction progressed to the point that assembly of the chair structure began in late October. The umbilical tower is a series of modules that are stacked on top of the chair. Offline subassembly of the first 4 modules, numbered 4 through 7, is progressing at a workspace in the KSC industrial area. The rig and set milestone marks the point where the chair structure is complete and the first module is ready to be stacked on top. That's currently projected somewhere after New Year's. Artemis IV is the first flight of the SLS Block 1B upgrade, and completing development of those elements will drive Space Launch System readiness for that launch. That includes the obvious exploration upper stage and the new connectors needed for that, the inner stage that connects EUS to the core stage, and the universal stage adapter that connects Orion to EUS. However, that also critically includes a major upgrade of the SLS flight software, which is developed within NASA Marshall Space Flight Center engineering. The SLS Exploration Computer Application Software, or ECAS, will control the entirety of the SLS mission, from 30 seconds before liftoff through spacecraft separation and EUS disposal. On the current SLS vehicle, the current version of the SLS flight software, called FCAS, or Flight Computer Application Software, rides on the core stage and only controls the flight for the first 9 minutes. After that, the United Launch Alliance ICPS flight computers and software control the rest of the launch vehicle's responsibilities, delivering Orion to its in-space injection trajectory, releasing the spacecraft, and then completing disposal and saving activities. During the quarter, we learned that Boeing completed certification of all the welding tools EUS uses at the Michoud Assembly Facility and at Marshall. A structural test article and flight article will be assembled for testing prior to Artemis IV, and welding of the STA started during this past quarter. First, the LH2 tank domes will be welded at MAF in that tool, and then those will be welded together in the vertical assembly center tool with a barrel to complete the tank structure. VAC welding was forecast for the February 2025 timeframe. There's still a lot of work left to do, and the forecast we got in November was for the STA to be completed in early 2026. The EUS flight article is the first working upper stage unit, so assembly and production of that is more complicated. We'll see if there's a new forecast for that in the new year. The existing SLS base elements, the solid rocket boosters and core stage, are under construction. The 10 solid rocket motor segments are in production by Northrop Grumman at their Promontory facilities in northern Utah, and Boeing is assembling Core Stage 4 in facilities at MAF and the Kennedy Space Center. There wasn't any update on booster production during the quarter, but most of the segments are already cast, and the boosters aren't a critical path item. For core stage production, the engine section for Core Stage 4 was set up in the Space Systems Processing Facility at KSC in October, and integration of that unit resumed after transportation from MAF in New Orleans. Boeing's ambition is to finish that stage in a couple of years, by the end of 2026. A lot will depend on progress finishing the Artemis III hardware before that. Boeing was planning to finish major structural welding of core stage elements at MAF in the first half of 2025, so that will be something to continue tracking. We got a visual look at the Artemis IV Orion primary structures for the crew module and crew module adapter, and the heat shield, since the carrier was delivered to KSC in late November. That was during the December 16th media event at Kennedy Space Center. The Artemis IV structures are mostly complete, but there wasn't much in the way of an update on the forecast for that build. From a priority standpoint, Artemis IV would be third in line behind the Artemis II and III builds. In terms of the outlook for Artemis IV, we're still waiting to see when the Halo module ships to Arizona and assembly of the first exploration upper stage propellant tanks. The modules making up the Mobile Launcher 2 umbilical tower are still expected to begin stacking on the chair structure beginning early in 2025. But beyond that, it's very difficult to tell how healthy the Artemis IV schedule is overall or for the individual programs, from Gateway to the Lunar Lander to the SLS upgrade and the new Mobile Launcher. The lack of perspective just adds to the uncertainty and doubt in public about the September 2028 target date. For Artemis V and beyond, or at least for those existing plans, work continues mostly in private, and since we're not getting much news about missions that aren't scheduled until the next decade, as we finish the first half of this decade and enter the second, more focus will be on the possible jeopardy some of those long-term plans are in right now. Thanks for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. We'll see if there's any news in this coming mostly holiday week around New Year's, and if there are any reveals about what might be coming when Musk and Trump come into power in a few weeks.